He found her bending over a basin of dishwater under a single naked bulb, sleeves rolled, hair caught back with a string so thin it might snap. The alley smelled of oil, cigarette smoke, and the damp city. The sound of metal on ceramic was a steady, small indictment. Sophia's hands were raw and quick, knuckles red, posture hunched so the world could seem smaller. When she looked up and met his eyes, those cold, deliberate eyes that had closed off so many pleas in the name of survival, there was no flicker of fear, only an exhaustion that reached deeper than night shifts and school absences. Luca Romano, who could count betrayal like currency, felt something in him, old and brittle, bend. Wait, before the next revelation unfolds. If this mystery has already captivated you, let us know where you're following this story from. To ensure you don't miss unexpected claims, broken bonds, or awakenings under the moon, subscribe and stay close. Now, back to the scene. He had been walking home from a late meeting with his lieutenant, the city's pulse still humming with the transactions of the hour. Promises made in low voices, debts noted on the back of envelopes. The alley belonged to a cafe that served overcooked pasta to graveyard shift workers and, on good nights, kept the whistle of the street alive with laughter. Luca knew the regulars, the owners, and the way favors circled like flies in summer. He did not expect a girl in a school uniform folding herself into the back room of the city's nocturnal kitchen. He especially did not expect the furious, protective ache that tightened under his sternum when he saw her. Elena had been in his employ for 10 years, the woman who kept his floor spotless, who mended the hems of his suits without a word, who cooked the kind of simple, honest food that belonged in another life. She swept ink stains from the margins of his ledgers, not with curiosity, but with the kind of loyalty that had once been currency in their neighborhood. She was supposed to be implacable in her discretion. Instead, when Luca called her to the back of the palazzo the next morning, her face told a story of sleeplessness that matched her daughter's. Refuge and stoicism, fear sharpened at the edges. "I saw her last night," Luca said, standing with the practiced indifference of a man who could reduce men to memories with a single order. He did not raise his voice because he never needed to. Control had always been in the cadence, the small assurances that what he said carried consequence. Elena's hands, still scented faintly of lemon and starch, trembled as she folded a towel. Her answer came wrapped in that survival composure he knew. "Sophia's been working at night for the cafe for a few weeks," she said. "They don't pay much. She said she—" Elena stopped, eyes darting like a sparrow trapped in glass. "She said she skipped school because she can't afford the lunch, because—" The sentence crumpled under its own shame. Luca watched the way Elena formed the words, how she guarded each one like a mother guarding a child on a dock from the tide. He read the ledger in her posture. There were unpaid lines, not just in ink, but in muscle memory. "Who sees to her when you're here?" he asked. He could have asked about teachers, about the rent, about the street enforcers. He chose a question that kept the shape of a threat between them without sounding like it. Elena's laugh was small and brittle. "I do. I always do." Her hands found his sleeve, a gesture of pleading dressed as habit. "Luca, you know I don't like trouble." That admission hung in the room with the weight of iron. In a world run by codes that had names and teeth, trouble rarely arrived without a price. Luca's mind, trained to calculate leverage, cataloged possibilities. He could wipe a name off a book and vanish a debt. He could use this family as a bargaining chip when the time came to trade territory with a rival. He could secure loyalty by reminding Elena who had the power to keep her daughter safe. Each option tasted differently in his mouth. Black coffee, cold iron, no taste at all. "You said she's been skipping school," Luca said, more an observation than a question. Elena nodded, and in that nod there was a storm of small, exact details that she could not hold back. "The inspector from District 3, "Corvo, he's been on our block," she murmured. "He keeps coming from Marco's tabs." Marco, an old name dragged through new gutters, was the husband who had disappeared into a wrong crowd 2 summers ago, leaving empty chairs and explanations that frayed like rope. They say Marco took money from them. He disappeared and didn't leave a coin. They came looking for what was owed. The cafe owner, he promised he'd let Sofia work in exchange. But Corvo says he wants more. He says he wants someone to be sure they get paid. Luca tasted the word like sour wine. Corvo was a crooked inspector who had built a small empire of favors and fear, and the men who orbited him were patient. They took first in pieces, small humiliations, and later they took everything. So she's working for them, letterings, messages? Elena's eyes flared. She had tried to protect her daughter from knowledge that has teeth. "No, not messages," she said quickly, as if denying would keep the shape of the truth from forming. Then her voice softened. "But she'll take envelopes. Sometimes she hands them to the boy who waits on the corner. She says she can't read the names. She says they're for the cafe, for the owner. I don't like it, Luca. I don't want my girl tied to anything that—" Her hand, the grandmotherly one that folded linens with the tenderness of confession, hovered over her chest. There was a pause between them that the palazzo swallowed whole. Luca thought of the ledger in his head, the way men's lives were recorded in small drafts, invisible balances that a signature could obliterate. He thought of his own code, the creed that had kept him tight-lipped and cold: never let mercy be your weakness. He thought of Elena's quiet, of her years at his side, about how she had once caught him in a lie and patted his brow like a child. He had paid her then with a pocket full of cash and a command that said nothing. She had kept the secret and folded it into herself. Secrets mattered in their city with an economy. They were currency that could be laundered or weapons that could be sharpened. "What does Sofia want?" he asked finally. Elena blinked. "She wants to save her brother," she said, Marco's lean name a stab of regret. "She says the shelter on the east side. There's a kid there, a boy who eats behind the fence because the volunteers don't look. They say he's gone soft. She says she promised him she'd get him out. She said if she could pay the man who runs it, if she could get what Corvo wants, maybe the boy could be free." It should have been a simple calculation. Luca could sign, wipe the ledger clean, push Corvo's claim into the gutter where rats gnawed at rotten favors. But in their world, nothing erased without reaction. Debt forgiven by a capo ricocheted to jealous rivals and suspicious allies. An act of mercy looked like weakness to a dog-eat-dog court, and enemies circled diners to smell the blood. "What does Corvo want?" Luca asked. Elena's lip trembled. Her hands, folded together, told of sleepless nights and desperate arithmetic. "He wants 2 deliveries a week. He wants a voice when he wants it. He wants Sofia to be around, just in case someone skips a payment." "If you could," she searched his face as if it were a map. "If you could stop him." It was a simple request planted on a bed of impossible consequences. Stop Corvo, shelter Sofia, rescue a child hidden behind chain link. Luca felt the city's arteries around him tighten, felt his men's whispers like static against his ear. The decision would ripple. Someone would interpret his act as a statement, a tender heart or a crack in the foundation to chew at. He could see the rival boss in the wings, licking his lips at an opening. He saw the crooked inspector recalculating his value. "You should not have let her work there," Luca said, and the words were neither reproach nor comfort. They were a statement of fact. In his world, the street was not for those who could be kept safe. "I thought we had no choice," Elena said. "When Marco disappeared, the lawyer said he was gone. The landlord wouldn't wait for promises. Sophia, she's proud. She thought if she could pay, no one would bother us. She thought she could buy time. He looked at Sophia then, at the picture in his mind of the girl rinsing at dawn, the bulb above her like a tiny moon, and understood the kind of pride that made someone empty their pockets into the hands of men with little mercy. Pride that kept a child from asking more of the world than the work it gave. He felt the old, stubborn thing in him rebel, not for the ledger, not for the loyalty ticked in black ink, but for the rightness of one small life to be allowed its future. Still, Luca could not act without thinking of consequence. A capo's mercy was a public transaction. It would be measured, judged, emulated. It would be used. He had learned that lesson in the slow grind of his father's rule. Kindness had been a liability that men could exploit. "So, if I stop Corvo," he said slowly, "what will you offer in return?" Elena's eyes went to the table, to the little things she had always given. Soup warmers, an extra hand on laundry day. She shook her head. "Nothing," she whispered. "There's nothing I can offer. Just—" her voice caught like a stitch. "Just let Sophia finish school. Let her be safe." The dilemma sat between them like a live wire. Luca imagined signing a piece of paper and watching the city tilt. He imagined the rival boss, Angelo Vieri, reading the move as an opportunity. He imagined Corvo screaming for retribution. He also imagined the face of the boy behind the shelter fence, image of small ribs and hollows. And he tasted a memory of a younger version of himself, hungry, steady, willing to barter dignity for bread. He had once been that boy in other hands. He had not forgotten what it was to be saved and then to owe the savior. "You will tell Sophia to stop taking envelopes," Lucas said finally. It was a command dressed as negotiation. "You will not let her go back to that cafe." Elena's shoulders relaxed in a way that was almost a sob. "Yes," she said. "And you will tell no one I am intervening," he added. "If it becomes known I bailed you out, there will be men who come asking for payment." Elena bowed like a woman learning to be grateful for a risk. "I won't say a word." It was a start, but a start that would have to be hidden from the city's gaze. Luca turned the ledger in his mind, small moves, precise placements. He would have to patch a tax here, misdirect a favor there. Find a way to make Corvo's appetite look satisfied without giving him the bread he wanted. He had tools, whispers, men with reputations, a few coins to grease palms. But each tool would sharpen the attention of others. As Luca walked out of the palazzo that day, the decision had been made only in part. He had given a command. It was small, tactical, the kind of mercy that allowed for leverage. But it was a beginning. The ache he felt was not only for the child or for the mother. It was the stirrings of something he had kept buried under vows and bulletproof routines. The possibility that his power could be used for something that did not serve his ledger. The city smelled different, as if the night had learned a new secret and was keeping it close. Outside, the rain began to come down, soft and relentless. It tapped on the pavements like coins counting off a life. And somewhere on the east side, behind chain link and flickering halogen, a boy turned in his sleep, unaware that someone had started the movement that might, painfully and precariously, set him free. The first night Luca tried to fix something without announcing it, he discovered how loud silence could be. He sent Matteo, a quiet man whose smile never reached his eyes, to the cafe with an envelope that smelled of cologne and the exact weight of surrender. It contained nothing but a folded piece of paper and Luca's name inked where debts usually lived. Matteo delivered it with the kind of politeness that spoke of consequences and walked away before anyone could think to follow. Luca watched the exchange from an alley across the street, rain freckling his shoulders, and felt a brittle satisfaction. This was how you bought a small peace without shouting from the rooftops. But peace is a fragile currency, and the world that traded in fear pays attention to the smallest withdrawals. Corvo noticed the envelope. He liked envelopes. He saw them as proof of attention, proof that men remembered you. He opened Luca's name and laughed, a sound that tasted like spoiled meat. He didn't take the payment as a favor. He took it as a message, and worse, as a puzzle. He wanted to know why the capo of the Southern Strip had reached across streets to touch the elbow of a woman who swept floors. When Luca climbed the palazzo stairs that night, Elena had laid out the tea in chipped cups. She refused to meet his eyes when he entered. Dignity had become a muscle she built lately because it was the only way to move through rooms where money had once spoken for itself. Sophia, more habit than outline, sat across from her, sleeves rolled, hands clenched in a posture of perpetual readiness. The uniform she was supposed to wear to class was folded neatly in her bag. Luca's order had been obeyed. That small obedience should have relieved him, but instead it set something tight in his chest. She obeyed because she had learned to obey, not because she wanted to. Obedience was a cheap thing in a city where favors cost futures. "You kept your promise," he said, and his voice was softer than it had any right to be. Elena blinked, and the cup shook. "Now you will keep yours," he added, and meant the bargain that always followed a favor, discretion. Sophia watched him the way a poised animal watches a stranger in its space, alert, calculating. Her eyes flared with the same exhausted steadiness he had seen in the alley. Luca had expected defiance, curiosity, perhaps arrogance. He hadn't expected the small tremor in her fingers, the same hesitation his father once had when he was asked to forgive and had never known why. "You didn't have to do that," she said finally, her voice thin as a wire. "I did," Luca answered. He could have told her the ledger reasons, that making obvious moves would set the rival animals hunting. He could have told her the practicalities, that it was better for business to keep certain debts alive, to collect on time and keep allies. He could not say why he had felt the need to reach for her life like a protective thing. Saying any of that would have been a kind of confession he had never learned to give. Sophia's jaw tightened. "You don't owe us anything," she said. "You forget you live in my city," he said, and the words were an attempt at levity that fell flat. What he wanted, something he did not yet name even to himself, was more dangerous than a pecuniary exchange. He wanted to understand who this girl was when she was not tired, when she did not move like someone who measured every breath. He was a man who had learned to expect people to fold under the weight of his gaze. Sophia simply took it and kept looking back. The first obstacles came quietly. Corvo did not disappear into anger. He expanded instead, like mildew. He began small, a patrol that lingered outside the palazzo gates, an inspector who asked about Elena's hours as if the question could lead to more, a knock at the door that was answered by Matteo's glove-covered hand, a note left under the door with a menacingly polite demand, "Keep your people honest." Luca met each of these with a measured answer, nothing that declared war, nothing that hummed with unnecessary insult. He redirected attention elsewhere, a missing shipment that required Corvo's men to chase phantom trucks, a forged permit that sent the inspector to the other side of the city at dawn. He patched things with favors and quiet displacements, the kind of maneuvers that cost men in time and gave nothing of the soul. But these acts drew eyes from other quarters. A rival, Angelo Vieri, began to circle more openly. He came to the club with his lieutenant, slapping the bottles and testing the room's temperature with a grin that never reached his eyes. Luca felt the glare of a man who smelled opportunity. Mercy could be a virus, and Vieri liked contagion. "You're soft, Roman," Angelo said once, his voice the kind of velvet that wrapped knives. "Everyone has to show their true colors sooner or later." "Toothless threats are for children," Luca replied. The answer kept the peace, for now. But Vieri's eyes tracked Sofia's name like a ledger entry being tallied. Rumor, like rot, moves quick through neighborhoods. The men Angelo kept were hungry for stories to bite into. They began to ask around the cafe about the maid's daughter who worked odd hours and moved like someone who carried two lives. Sofia heard the whispers before Luca could smooth them. One afternoon at school, a boy who served as a conduit for neighborhood gossip, piecework handed off in the playground like contraband, cornered her near the lockers. "Heard your capo friend is buying favors," he said, half mocking, half warning. The word capo cut through the air like a shard. She felt it scrape against her ribs. Sofia fought to make her face neutral. She had learned that embarrassment was a currency she could not afford. Shame often invited violence. "He didn't do that," she said. He helped with some bills." The boy snorted. "Everybody helps when it's for a show. He wants something. He always does." He walked away, chin up, like he had delivered a blessing. She did not tell Elena about the exchange. She sat in the schoolyard that afternoon and watched the other girls talk about prom and grades like a world that contained no predators. Her thoughts were not of dances or college essays, but of the thin frames of a shelter's kids and the remembered smell of someone who hadn't been home in 2 years. She had been pretending that Luca's involvement was a kindness that could be washed with dishes and hidden under aprons. Now it stuck to her like oil. When the first threat arrived in a form she could no longer ignore, it was unglamorous and clever. A boy from Angelo's crew, someone Luca had thought indifferent, fell in with the cafe's night staff as a busboy. He was attentive in a way that suggested interest in more than plates. He asked Sofia questions about deliveries and schedules, the kind of conversational probing that had less to do with menus and more to do with mapping routines. He smiled the smile of a man cataloging a route. Sofia told Elena about the boy, and they argued, small, desperate female words traded like armor. "We should tell him," Elena said, naming Luca as if the syllable would be a shield. Sofia resisted. Pride and fear braided together in her throat. "He'll think I'm using him," she said. "I don't want to be that. I don't want him thinking I'm a charity case." "You think I don't know what it is to be charity?" Elena snapped, old wounds cracking open. She softened immediately. "I only mean you don't have to do this alone." That night, Luca found himself sitting on the worn bench outside the palazzo, listening to the city like it was a live thing breathing. He had not planned to be a savior. He had planned to be a man whose ledger balanced and whose enemies did not take advantage. Yet here he was, choosing a shape he had long avoided, the man who intervened in someone else's life without naming the cost. He felt like a trespasser in his own need. The problem was that compassion in his world broadcasts louder than gunfire. Someone would see an opening. Someone would read his interference as weakness that could be manipulated. He knew the math, the brutal calculus. The more he protected, the more he needed to show force to keep predators at bay. Force invites counters. Counters are always ugly. The next morning, Matteo came with news that tasted of cold metal. Corvo had been appealing to a higher authority, Maria Santoro, the councilwoman who liked to keep her hands clean and her influence muddy. She had begun asking questions about the cafe's licensing and the men who lingered near its stoop. Luca felt the shift of gears in his chest. Politics had its own hunger, and it could consume the dead and the living without discernment. Sophia learned of it when she opened a textbook and found a folded slip of paper tucked between pages of algebra, an old method of communication that felt almost quaint, except that the words were a threat. "Tell your maid to stop poking her head into business that isn't hers," it read. The note had no signature. Signatures were unnecessary in their city. The message was clear in tone: step away, and they would step into her life instead. For Sophia, the note was an eruption. She sat in the classroom and let the paper burn cold in her hands. The teacher called on her, and the name sounded distant, as if someone else was speaking. For the first time since she'd started trading school for shifts, she understood the true cost of asking for help. Help was a door that, once opened, required payment. The payment could be in favors, in silence, in a life rearranged to suit the creditor. Luca watched her the next day from the doorway of his office, pretending business awaited him on the desk. There was a way she carried herself now that was not only exhaustion but a growing wariness. The girl's eyes measured distances like someone who had learned to expect sudden chasms. He wanted to tell her the note had come from his enemies, or from a man who wanted to test him. He wanted to tell her that he would make them answer. But there is a line he had always observed: do not drag those you claim to protect into the teeth of your fight. To protect was to fight in the shadows, and he had enough shadows. Instead, he walked her home after school that evening, giving a reason about paperwork and the need to show a face in the neighborhood. They walked in silence, the kind of heavy quiet that keeps words behind molars. When they reached the Palazzo gates, Sophia turned to him and said, with an honesty that felt like violence, "If you do anything, make sure it doesn't make things worse." Luca stared at her, at the way her fingers curled like a fist around the strap of her bag. "I'll make sure." He lied with the kind of small, tender cruelty men teach themselves to live by. Promises in his world carried a different currency. They were not always given freely, and when given, they were often bargaining chips with a side of risk. In the days that followed, Luca's measures grew more intricate. He placed an informant inside the councilwoman's office who reported the time of Maria's visits and the names she called on. He created a sting in the shipping lanes that forced Angelo's men to waste fuel and time on phantom runs. He called in an old favor, a man with a loud reputation who could make the inspector's life uncomfortable if he lingered too close to the palazzo. Each move was a stitch in a net he hoped would catch nothing but attention. But power cannot stay unseen. Men noticed the tug of influence and adjusted. Angelo began to shift his tone from playful threat to scrutinizing interest. He asked about the maid's family at the club, wanting to know the margins of Luca's mercy. Corvo began to make small talk with cafe customers, asking questions that sounded harmless and were not. The world began to hum with the sense that something had been altered, and men who feed on instability found their mouths watering. The first real fracture came not from outside, but from within. Matteo, who had always been a faithful man, came to Luca with his face weathered in a way that suggested loyalty running thin. "You're making enemies," he said, and it was less a warning than a pleading. "Are you telling me to stop?" Luca asked, and the question could have been vicious. Matteo looked like a man holding a coin he could no longer afford. "I'm telling you to pick what you want more carefully. There are rules, boss. Even mercy has rules here." His words struck Luca like a thrown stone. He had always known the rules. They were the rails that kept his trains from plunging. Breaking them for the sake of a woman's child felt like a small betrayal of that system. But he also felt something else, an upwelling of stubbornness that came from a childhood where someone had lifted him up and then disappeared. He had not forgotten the shape of mercy done without expectation. He chose to keep going. But choices have echoes. Angelo, watching the pattern, made a public show of generosity. He paid the cafe owner a contrived visit and left a diamond watch on the counter like a declaration. The move was theatrics, a man showing that he could spend on whimsy and that money could buy spectacle. It was also a question aimed at Luca's chest. How will you answer when I act as if you care? Luca answered the way he always did, with a measure of cruelty disguised as calm. He sent Angelo a bottle of rare liquor and a note that read, simply, "Drink it in peace." It was a gesture meant to neutralize. Instead, it invited curiosity. Angelo smiled wider, pleased that the game had legs. Sophia watched all of this from the narrow windows of her life, and each maneuver felt like a footstep approaching her thin walls. Sometimes she resented him for the attention he drew. Other times she resented herself for needing the help. She began to dream at odd hours of a future where she could sit in a classroom without counting the cost of a misstep. She wanted normality like a hunger, small, persistent, and embarrassing to voice. And through it all, Luca found himself learning the dangerous work of intimacy by degrees. He listened for the tremor in Elena's voice when she spoke of the shelter. He started to memorize the little ways Sophia laughed when she thought no one was watching, how she chewed the inside of her cheek when she was embarrassed. These were small thefts, illicit and utterly human. He stole them and then felt guilty, because stealing comfort from someone made him feel like a thief who had no right to the warmth he took. The world tightened then, like a fist. Corvo shifted from menace to action. A missed delivery, an envelope turned into a threat, a busboy who suddenly had new bruises and a better watch. The men he worked with came to Luca saying plainly that the other families were watching, and what he had done for one household could become precedent. Public mercy could unravel the careful patterns of fear the families relied upon. It was a problem without a map. Luca's men wanted to lash out. His own hunger for something that resembled rightness wanted to move like a wave through the city. The cost would be high. He had already seen the teeth of a rival sharpening, the watchful eyes of a crooked inspector, and the fragile hope in a mother's hands. At night, he lay awake, thinking not of ledgers and property lines, but of a boy behind a chain link, and of a girl who scrubbed plates with a determination that humbled him. In the hard theater of his life, he wondered which role he was meant to play: the man who sustained the city's order with iron, or the one who let order bend just enough to make room for someone else's salvation. The answer would not come quietly. The city had a way of forcing decisions to bloom into crisis. The enemy did not need to push him. They merely needed to wait until the next wrong step. And when that step came, it would be a reckoning that would test not only the ledger of favors, but the fragile, dangerous new things beginning to grow in the dark folds of Luca Romano's heart. The first real fracture opened not with a gunshot, but with a photograph. It arrived folded inside a plain envelope on Luca's desk at dawn. The edges of the paper smudged as if someone had touched it after rain. Matteo set it there with hands that trembled the way a guilty priest's hands do. Luca unfolded the image without a prayer. Elena, arms bound behind her, a strip of dirty cloth of her mouth, sat on a concrete floor, a puddle of shadow pooling at her boots. The camera had been cruelly intimate, close enough to see the fray at the hem of her dress, the fleck of flour on her cheek. Behind her, a dull iron door. The notes scribbled on the back were a blunt, bureaucratic cruelty. Tell your capo to stop. Something in Luca's chest went cold and loud and then quieted into an anger that felt like wind across an abyss. He looked up at Matteo. The man's face had the slackness of someone who had seen a life's tally balance against a reckoning. "Who brought it?" Luca asked, and the question was meant to be a blade. Matteo's lips thinned. A courier from Corvo's people. They left it under the gate. Then a message came through. Someone had seen Elena leaving the cafe last night. His words were clipped as if by necessity. They say she was intercepted near the east lot, taken by men who don't work for Angelo. Angelo's men didn't need permission to be cruel. Corvo's demanded exercise of power like a habit. Luca felt a low, animal sound in his throat, a thing that was neither grief nor fury, but the two braided together in a dangerous cord. He had known this was a possibility, had feared it even, but seeing the photograph made the threat tactile. Someone had crossed a line. Someone had used the woman who had kept his shirts pressed and his secrets folded like clean linen as proof that he would be touched if he interfered. Sophia found out before anyone wanted her to know. She was at school, fists in her pockets, when Matteo's runner, young, pale, and with jacket too big, arrived, breathless and apologetic. The boy hesitated, eyes flicking to the teachers like a man about to confess in public. "They took your mother," he said, and the words were a physical thing, an object thrown through a window. The classroom dissolved. Chairs scraped, a teacher shouted, and Sophia stood, the room narrowing into the geometry of her own panic. Her knees were cotton where she had once been steady. She tried to run and clung instead to the edge of the courtyard, as if the building itself might steady her. When Luca arrived moments later, the students parted like dark water around a ship, their eyes bright and curious, the way neighborhoods are when they are bathed in someone else's calamity. He did not reach for his gun. He reached for Elena's photograph, and then for Sophia. She was not a child anymore, but she clung to him the way a frightened thing clings to a tree. Her breath hitched against his breastbone. "I told them we didn't need help," she whispered, truths tumbled and raw. "I told them I could handle it." "You did not keep them safe," Luca said, and there was nothing but fact in his voice. The truth did not soften the blow. It sharpened it, and it lodged like a splinter inside them both. The next hours came in hard clicks. Matteo with reports, men sent to fences and yards, the older hands who moved like ghosts, doing what they had always done, make inquiries and collect rumors. Luca ordered the palazzo locked and arranged for men to sweep the east side. He called in a favor from a judge who owed him a night of silence. He painted a map of Corvo's likely hideouts and set his men to each line like a careful surgeon. But the city is a nest of small loyalties that snap under pressure. It doesn't take much to pull at a thread and watch the whole weaving come undone. Matteo, under the weight of panic and the soft, insistent tug of self-preservation, came to Luca hours later with a confession that sounded like a verdict. "I saw Sophia talking to a boy from Angelo's crew," Matteo said, his eyes avoiding Luca's. "Not just talking. Hands passed. Envelopes. I'm sorry, boss. I should have said before. I didn't think." His voice wavered, as if guilt were a currency he couldn't afford. Luca closed his eyes. The news landed like a brick. Betrayal here did not have to be venomous to be lethal. It could be the inattentive kind, the careless exchange of an envelope for gratitude. "Where?" Luca demanded, and his question asked for the panorama. "Behind the bakery off Via Gallo, twice last week." The picture of Sophia's hands, those small, work-roughened hands in the alley, moved in his head. She had said she could not read names. She had said the envelopes were for the cafe. Had she lied to protect Elena? Had she lied to protect herself? Or worse, had she been a pawn in a game she didn't realize was played on a board with sharp edges? Luca summoned Sophia that night under the pretense of paperwork. The palazzo ate sound. Footsteps in its halls sounded as if they were being swallowed whole. Sophia stood in the doorway, the uniform bag slung over one shoulder like a relic. Her face, lit by the soft lamp, had a dusk in it. She looked older. She looked as if sleep had been something someone else used. "You've been seen delivering," Luca said. He had not raised his voice, but the room held its breath as if waiting for a verdict. Sophia's eyes filled with a tired defiance. "I was delivering envelopes to the cafe," she said. "They asked me to." "Who asked you?" Luca pressed. He needed a name, a lever, a place to anchor himself so the world would not slide any further. "Sergio." The name came out small, like a confession pulled from deep water. He said the inspector wanted them. He said it was to help keep the cafe open. He said we had to help Marco. Her voice shredded. "I didn't know they would use him. I didn't know." "You didn't know," Luca echoed, tasting residue like copper on his tongue. "Or you couldn't bear to question people while your mother was worrying about bread." The accusation was not entirely his. It was the city's. Sophia's silence had not been a trick. It had been the kind of compromise poverty breeds. She flinched. "I didn't think Elena would get taken," she said. "I never thought I thought—" Her sentence dissolved. Luca saw suddenly the scaffolding of her choices. A boy behind a shelter fence, the smell of a hospital, the landlord's patience thinning. He saw pride and fear braided into a rope that now choked them. The revelation that Sophia had been handling envelopes for Angelo's men fractured what little trust had been forming. Luca's men looked at one another. Veterans whose work was stability felt the ground shift beneath their boots. To some of them, Luca's softness, his recent gestures, had already been an aberration, an anomaly that might be exploited. The revelation gave them cause to whisper. "You were careless," Matteo muttered when they thought Sophia couldn't hear. "You put family in danger. Who knows what else was in those envelopes?" The words were needles. They pricked Luca in an unexpected place, the bruise where pride sat, the one that told him he could still choose. He watched Sophia crumble under the weight of the men's disappointed looks. She wasn't the only one betrayed. He felt betrayed by the city's demand for bartered favors, by the way loyalty was bought and sold, by the way his attempt at quiet mercy had been misread or misused. Then came another unraveling, quieter but more corrosive. Elena, when they finally found her and brought her back to the palazzo, bloodied in a way that the photograph had not shown, the knuckles swollen, a purple bruise beneath one eye, sat Luca down and told a story he did not expect. "I didn't tell you everything," she said, her voice the low coo of someone trying to shape confession into a shield. The palazzo's walls leaned in. "Years ago, before I worked for you, there was a man who tried to ruin your father. I was there. I saw his face when he tried to walk away. I told my neighbor, and then the neighbor told another, and then someone told you. You didn't know I had told, but I had. I helped you once. I gave you a shadow when you were small." The room tilted, the air gone thin. Luca's face, the face that had always been a mask of control, tightened. Memory is not a thing one wears lightly. It has claws. "You saved him then," Elena continued, "and he looked at me like I was a bridge, withered and important at the same time." She stopped. Tears cut tracks down her cheeks. "You were a boy with hands that wanted more than they could take. I wrapped myself around that, like a warm thing. I never told because you would not have wanted me to, but they will use it. If Corvo finds out you were once small and helped by someone they could shame, they will use that. They will say you are weak because you were indebted." Luca's chest moved. In his childhood, there had been a night of hunger and a woman who put her own food aside. He had remembered the favor as a ledger entry, repaid with loyalty. but he had not understood the fragility it created should someone else name it. "You kept my secret," he said at last. It was not a question. He had not expected to be vulnerable to gratitude. Vulnerability tastes like iron in a mouth unused to it. Elena's hands fluttered. "I kept it because you were a boy," she said, "and I thought it would make you a man. Now they will use it to tell stories. They will say the capo of the South was once gifted mercy, and that mercy comes back around." Her words stitched a new worry into Luca's mind. The city would not only punish him for fighting, it would punish him for having once been human. The thought pierced him. He had been building a fortress of fear, but never thought the world would take that past and turn it into fuel. Back in the cafe, rumors had metastasized into accusations. Angelo, clever and theatrical, had started a whisper campaign. "You mess with the wrong house," his men said in low laughter. Corvo fed the gossip with a smile that had a nasty habit of lingering. Maria Santoro, with her neutral hands and greedy eyes, began to prod politically, asking in public about the Palazzo's charitable funds. The city watched and waited to see how Luca would answer, with brutality or with more of the tenderness that looked like weakness. As the fractures multiplied, Elena's past weaponized, Sophia's complicity revealed, Matteo's faltering loyalty, the Palazzo felt narrower. Men who had once stood shoulder to shoulder with Luca began to count their options. Alliances shifted like driftwood. A whisper from the eastern docks suggested an old ally was reconsidering. Another suggested someone else had been promised the South Strip if Luca's power diminished. Sophia, at the center of this roiling sea, learned in the hardest way that good intentions could be harvested into ammunition. She watched the men she had only just started to trust turning their faces away, heard the low tone of voices that cataloged her as a risk. She began to understand what Elena had always hidden, that survival in their city meant becoming a ledger, not a person. And the ledger, once read, could be marked up by anyone with the patience to wait. Late that night, Luca stood on the terrace and let the city breathe under him like an animal in the dark. He tried to measure the cost of the mercy he'd given. Beneath him lay a map of the cracks. A woman bound in a photograph. A girl's hands carrying envelopes. A past favor that could be turned into a weapon. He had wanted to be a protector and had only proven himself a target. He thought about the sound of Elena's laugh when she was trying to hide a sorrow, the way Sophia chewed the inside of her mouth when she was embarrassed, the way Matteo had looked like a man carrying a burden too heavy to frame. Each face was a small rumor now, a potential excuse for the city to rearrange itself around him. The fractures had started to widen. Alliances shifted, whispers turned to threats, and as the sun bled into the city's gutters, Luca realized the only way to stop the collapse was to leap. But a leap would cost him what he had always valued most: control. He had to decide whether to trade the last of his untouchable cold for something messy and human. And in that choice, he risked not only everything he'd built, but the fragile, dangerous hope forming in the palms of a girl who had once scrubbed dishes at 3 in the morning. Luca did not wait for his men to draft plans. He moved with the certainty of a man who had decided to burn the ledger rather than let it be written on him. He summoned Matteo and 3 of the oldest hands, men whose faces had been carved by winters and whose loyalty had been paid in nights rather than coin. "We take Elena back quietly," he said. "We make Corvo believe he's delivered proof. We take the players one by one, and we set a trap where the light is brightest." His voice carried the simplicity of a command and the violence of a promise. Their plan was surgical and ugly. Matteo would feed a rumor to Angelo's camp that Luca had given up, softened by humiliation and ready to make peace. The rumor would be a bait, a public smallness that would make Angelo preen. Angelo would expose his hand to gain favor from the other families and Maria Santoro, and in exposing it, he would show the people who actually held the strings. Corvo, greedy and certain, would accept whatever image he was given and parade it before his superiors. While they entertained hubris in public, Luca would strike at the place's pride left exposed. Sophia wanted to be part of the plan. She wanted to run into darkness with a knife clenched between her teeth. "I can find where they keep her," she insisted, voice a blade sharpened on fear. Luca looked at her the way you look at a match held too close to curtains, something that could light a room or burn it down. "You stay with Elena's friends," he said, "the order a shield. You wait by the east lot for me. If anything moves, you run to the church and do not stop until you reach the steps." It was a ridiculous instruction for a woman taught to move like a ghost, but it was also the kind of tenderness he had never learned how to give, specific, actionable protection. The night they moved, the city felt like a held breath. Matteo and his men slid through the east lots like ghosts who had been given addresses, and Luca, silent as a vow, met with a courier who had been paid to look distracted. They planted a photograph, a forged, staged image of Elena in a broken stairwell, tears carefully applied, the suggestion that she had been humiliated but would be released for the right price. Corvo took the bait with a greedy ferocity. It was exactly the spectacle he wanted. He arranged for a drop that was public enough to be recorded and private enough for the men who watched the alley to believe they had a score to settle. Angelo, smelling a play, strode into the game with the arrogance of a man who thought theater was his right. He wanted a public humiliation of Luca because it would ratify his own climb. He sent men to the east lot to make sure the show would have the right audience. Luca's men surrounded the lot hours before the staged exchange. They hid in shadows, in gutters, in the flaps of collapsing warehouses, until Luca, in a coat that carried the scent of rain and iron, stepped into the light, the bait's counterpart. He let Angelo's boys see him, let their eyes measure his chest, let the rumor of his weakness settle briefly into the space between them. Then Luca watched them gather, predictable as storm clouds. When Corvo's men arrived with Elena, they found the lot empty, deliberately, cruelly so. A cloth had been tied to the fence that read like a taunt. Publicity sold separately. Corvo stammered. His men, hungry for acknowledgement, jabbed fingers and demanded answers they could not control. Angelo's men laughed. The scent of triumph was intoxicating. That was when Luca struck, not with bullets, not with bombs, but with a dismantling that stripped performance of its comfort. He had arranged for a local inspector, a small official who owed him favors, to make a routine check on a corrugated warehouse 2 blocks away. The inspector's knock summoned neighbors who, in tightening the circle of ordinary curiosity, drew Angelo's men out of their choreography. With the crowd's attention snagged on other noise, Matteo and 2 men slipped into the alley where Elena had been kept and found her, bruised, exhausted, but alive, hidden behind a stack of oil drums. They moved with the careful brutality of those who have stolen something back. Elena's throat was kissed with apologies backed by fists. Luca's hands shook only once when he found her and then steadied into the business of healing. He carried her to the palazzo like a man who was carrying a piece of his own past back into place. When Sophia saw them emerge, when she flung herself into her mother's arms and wept like the world had been made whole again, it was the kind of rupture that rearranged Luca's insides in ways a ledger never could. But rescue is not triumph. The act of saving Elena unlatched consequences. Corvo, humiliated, blasted rumors, screams that Luca had staged the rescue to show he could take what he wanted publicly. Angelo swore vengeance with the hot temper of a wounded animal. Maria Santoro made noises about legal investigations, about the capo who had overstepped, the man who had turned charity into showmanship. The city, always hungry for a story, fed on each new iteration. In the smallest hour, when Elena slept in a chair with a blanket over her knees and Sofia sat awake like a sentinel, Luca did what he had not prepared to do. He let himself be seen. He sat by the window and watched them, mother and daughter, and for once he let a human reason guide the ledger. He moved closer to Sofia, and when she looked up, her eyes raw and red, he heard the small question in her silence. Why, it seemed to ask, why risk yourself for us? He could have parried with the language of power, because the city cannot be allowed to eat the weak, because precedent matters. But he chose instead a truth he had kept caged. Because I was once the boy they thought would be easy to crush, he said. The words fell like coins. Because someone reached for me when no one else would. I remember what that felt like. Sofia's response was not immediate. She had been taught to accept help as a transaction, not a gift. But the way her jaw softened, the way a muscle near her eye eased, was an answer. She leaned forward and rested her head briefly against his shoulder like a thing reclaiming warmth. In that small contact, no vows, no bargains, something shifted. The palazzo did not tremble. The city did not immediately reorder. But the geometry of their relationship changed. A claim was made without fanfare. Luca's sacrifice was not only risk to reputation. He made choices that would split his world. He gave orders to sweep Angelo's men into distant jobs, pulling favors from old debts until his chest felt hollow. He ordered Corvo's men reassigned through bureaucratic pressure, leaned on a commissioner to shift patrols. These moves cost him alliances. Men muttered that their boss had become sentimental. Favor banks, once full, began to show thinness at the edges. But Elena slept in a room warmed by a heater that would no longer be repossessed, and Sofia remained at school, the uniform pressed and present. The tenderest sacrifice he made had a quiet, intimate cruelty. He invited Sofia to a small lunch in the palazzo's back garden, not as a patron, but as a man who wanted to offer dignity. He arranged for a scholarship in the name of an anonymous donor, a fund that would pay for Sofia's schooling without her being held as a mark. When she discovered the fund, when Elena, with tears that tasted like relief, told her the truth, Sofia's reaction was a mix of gratitude and shame. She wanted to push away the idea that she owed something. Luca sat with that tension, like a man sitting with an old grief. "Keep it secret," he told Sofia, the way one might tell a prayer. "Make it your own." He would continue to protect from the edges, to fight networked fights in the dark. He knew the price. Alliances frayed, whispers that he had softened too much, men who would test the borders of his mercy. But that night, as he watched Elena and Sofia laugh over absurd gossip about the cafe owner's bad coffee, he felt a warmth that no ledger could compute. Months later, when Angelo found his men short on recruits and Corvo's career stalled under bureaucratic clutter, the city rearranged itself around the idea that Luca's mercy had been a choice, not a weakness. The families readjusted their calculus. A capo could show kindness and still cut down with ruthless precision. It was a lesson that both terrified and reassured. The cost had been paid in bruises to alliances, and the slow erosion of unquestioned fear. Luca's world was smaller in some ways, fewer men who would follow him into indiscriminate violence, but it was larger in others. He had staked a claim not only on the city's map, but on something tender between two people who had been invisible to the ledger for too long. One evening, not long after Elena could walk to the market without looking like she carried the men's hands, Sofia found Luca on the terrace. Rain had started to fall, a thin, persistent thing that made the city smell honest. Sophia stood close enough that their shoulders almost touched. She was no longer the girl in the alley. She carried herself with a new steadiness, like someone who had been handed a chance and chosen to keep it. "You made a mess," she said, not unkindly. "You broke things." "I did," he admitted. "And I will fix what I break." She let out a small laugh that tasted like something fierce being born. "Then stay broken with me," she said, an absurd, courageous invitation. Luca's answer was not a promise of forever in grand language, for he had learned how fragile such words are in their city. He placed his hand over hers, a small claim, a private stamp. "I'll stand with you," he said. It was less than a vow, more than a bargain. And as the rain washed the palazzo steps and the city hummed like an orchestra tuning, Luca understood that redemption was not a single blow, but a series of choices. Each one would cost him. Each one would cost the people he loved. Yet in the quiet that followed his answer, in the careful way Sophia smiled, and Elena looked up like someone who had not expected mercy and then accepted it, he felt the shape of a new normal being sketched, messy, dangerous, and painfully, wonderfully human. The new normal settled not like an edict, but like a bruise that slowly faded into a new skin, sensitive at first, then calloused, then part of the shape of him. Days moved in small, stubborn rhythms. Elena tending to the palazzo's linens with hands that knew how to make warmth from thread. Sophia at her desk, head bent over algebra problems and a scholarship letter folded into the margins of her notebook like a secret talisman. Luca signing papers that rerouted favors into quiet protections rather than loud shows. The men who remained in his orbit watched the adjustments with the wary patience of survivors learning a new route through a familiar storm. Some left, others stayed. The ones who saw in his stubborn new mercy not softness, but a different kind of strength. At night, the palazzo held laughter again, the brittle, cautious laughter of people trying out joy like a borrowed coat. Elena cooked something that tasted like a summer she once had. Sophia told a story, a small, ridiculous claim about a cafe owner who confused salt for sugar, and they all laughed until something in the room loosened. Luca listened, a stranger learning to inhabit a presence that did not always require calculation. When Sophia looked up and met his gaze, she did not ask for payment or parry with suspicion. She offered the simple, dangerous thing of trust. Outside, the city rearranged its rules in ways that were both subtle and savage. Angelo Vieri learned that posturing invites risks you cannot control. He found fewer followers when the ledger of fear no longer served as unquestioned currency. Corvo was shuffled into paperwork and obscurity by the very bureaucracy that once fed him. He raged into forms and found them unreadable. Power rebalanced, as it always does, by bites and counterbites. Luca's footprint shrank around him in some parts and widened in others. He paid for his choices in lost alliances and in the way men began to measure their sentences before speaking his name. But what no ledger could account for was the way a city could soften, just a little, around a household. Sophia finished the term with grades that startled even her. She enrolled in a class on late afternoons, the one she had always wanted, and she learned to speak in ways that were not always about survival. Elena planted beans in a crate on the terrace and watched them push toward the sun like a miracle that required only patience and water. One evening, when rain came thin and honest and the palazzo smelled of wet stone and lemon soap, Sophia found Luca on the terrace, as she often did now. No announcement, no escort, just the quiet fact of his presence. She stood beside him, close enough to feel the warmth that had nothing to do with power. Around them, the city shimmered, windows like tiny ships of light. "You kept your word," she said, not as an accusation, but as a report. "I kept mine," he answered. There was a softness to the words that he had not learned to wear publicly. They were private currency. He did not promise her a future free of harm. He had learned such vows were brittle. But he offered the steadiness of intent. "I'll keep keeping it," he added, and his voice had the small humor of a man confessing an imperfect vow. Sophia let out a breath that might have been a laugh. "Then stand with me." He did not kneel, and he did not make grand declarations. He placed a palm over hers, a small seal on a pact neither of them dared name. The rain made patterns on the stone steps below, cartographies of rain and light. In the city of ledgers, favors, and old violences, a different accounting had begun. One measured in breakfasts shared, in algebra problems solved, in a mother's laughter no longer guarded by fear. They stood together as the night bent around them, a trio stitched into a world that would never be safe, only survivable, and sometimes, like now, unexpectedly gentle. The palazzo's lamps hummed. The distant sirens kept time like a reminder that danger slept nearby. But under the thin, steady rain, Luca understood that power could be a shield rather than a sword, and that some debts were worth paying with the only currency left to him, the small, stubborn human thing of staying.